And now your host, Richard Thomas.
Hello, and welcome to It's a Miracle. We've got a lot of ground to cover on this episode, from Vietnam during the height of the war to a remote Canadian lake during the dead of winter. So let's get started. Our first story shows that if charity begins at home, it may end halfway around the world. It also reveals how our lives can be rewarded with miracles when we follow our hearts, even when following them leads us into dangerous territory. Ever since she was a child, Leanne Duello tried to help other children less fortunate than herself.
I've trick-or-treated for UNICEF when I was a little kid, and I was just a little kid myself when I decided I was going to adopt a child someday. I was probably only 8 or 10 when I made that important decision.
And she shared her decision with the man she eventually married, Mark Tiemann.
Leanne told me about her desire to someday adopt a child, and it sounded like a good idea to me.
So then it sort of became our dream, so it was something we always planned on doing together.
But their plans were delayed by the birth of 2 daughters.
And we were looking at the desire to have a son, and at that point in time, we decided, well, let's look into adoption.
It was 1973, and the Vietnam War had divided the American people. While some protested U.S. involvement in the war, others turned their attention to the plight of innocent victims, war orphans. And as luck would have it, Leanne also became involved.
Hi, how are you?
Thank you.
What's this for?
Kids in Vietnam?
Oh, the Friends of Children of Vietnam. I've heard about you guys.
I'd love something.
I stopped just to buy a dozen cupcakes to try and make a difference.
Along with the cupcakes, Leanne picked up a brochure announcing a meeting, which she later attended.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Within a few weeks, the chapter president resigned. I became the chapter president.
We're having a bake sale next weekend at the church, and I need someone to fill in the time slot from 1 to 3.
And my basement became the Iowa chapter headquarters of Friends of Children of Vietnam. And all this from stopping to buy a dozen cupcakes.
Maybe we should give Brian a call.
Yeah, here.
It was during this time that Leanne became friends with another volunteer, Carol Day.
It was a perfect opportunity to be involved in something like that because
We were young mothers and we had a passion for children.
That's it.
we planned events, planned bake sales, and we did all kinds of things. And so it was a good thing for a young mother to do.
Because Mark and I had this dream of adopting a child, and our daughters were just 2 and 4 at the time, we decided this was a good sign to pursue our adoption dreams. And because I was working with Friends of Children of Vietnam, it was just made sense that we would go through that agency.
And so Leanne and Mark began the complicated process of adopting a Vietnamese orphan.
I'm so excited.
A process that could take as long as 3 years.
Then I went to the National Conference for Friends of Children of Vietnam in Denver, Colorado. And that really inspired me all the more because I could see pictures of the kids and I was just on fire with this cause when I left that conference.
Her enthusiasm could not have come at a greater moment.
I'd be honored to go.
I was completely blown away when a few weeks later they called me and asked if I would fly to Vietnam and help bring 6 babies to their pre-assigned homes in the United States.
The only hitch, she would need a traveling companion.
And so I said to Leanne, well, how about if I go with you? Which I think shocked her, but we quite quickly made that plan then to go together to Saigon.
And wouldn't you know, within just a few weeks, there was a tremendous Viet Cong offensive.
The enemy was closing in on Saigon, the city where they were scheduled to land in less than 3 weeks.
That's when I got afraid, and I didn't want to keep my promise to go anymore. I remember calling the Denver headquarters and telling them how scared I was.
I'm just feeling kind of uncomfortable about going. Do I have to go?
And they said, of course you don't have to go. And I said,
Well, who's going to bring all those babies back if I don't go?
and they admitted, maybe no one.
As the bombs fell nearer to Saigon, Leanne and Carol became more terrified, but continued to honor their commitment.
I called the State Department every single day saying, should we still go? And I guess in my heart I was wishing they'd say, no, you better not go, it's too dangerous. But they never said that.
There was bombing within 3 miles of the Saigon city limits, just the day before I was to leave. And I remember it was Easter Sunday. And I went to church with my family like we always did. And I literally knelt there and prayed that God would give me a sign I didn't have to go. But instead I was just filled with this overwhelming confidence and certainty that I was supposed to go, that He would take care of me.
We actually left then the very 1st of April. And of course, being April Fool's Day, Leanne and I looked at each other and we said, well, is this symbolic or what? We weren't quite sure.
Why is this plane so empty?
I don't know.
As Carol and Leanne made their way across the Pacific, they realized that only a handful of people were making the dangerous trip.
And I remember asking the stewardess, why are you taking such a big plane with so few people to Saigon? And she reminded me because the plane would be full coming back. So it was a little unsettling to realize that we're flying into a place that everybody else is trying to get out of.
Nor was she prepared for what she would find there, a city in chaos.
And that was unlike anything these Iowan homemakers had ever witnessed in our lives. Stark realization that this was a country at war.
Against this backdrop of turmoil, Leanne learned that the plans had changed.
President Gerald Ford has okayed Operation Babylift. You're not going to take out 6 babies. You'll help take out 300 if we're lucky.
It wasn't until they reached the orphanage that the magnitude of their assignment hit them.
There were babies everywhere, and there were workers everywhere, and the babies were crying, some were sleeping, but there were just literally side-by-side babies in every room.
And I remember saying, take my picture now, Carol, because I want this to be the first photo of me in Vietnam. And that photo turned out to be pretty significant later on in our journey.
It was now only a matter of days before Saigon would fall, and in the rush to prepare the children for transportation, Leanne received the surprise of her life from FCVN director Sherry Clark.
She said, you've probably figured this out by now, and I hadn't. But you and Mark are going to be assigned one of the 100 babies we have gathered here so far. Now you can wait and be assigned a baby from across the desk in Denver, or you can walk into the next room and choose a son. And I did.
As Leanne entered the room, a little boy reached out for her, almost as if he had been expecting her. And Leanne's heart was instantly filled with love.
That moment is as awesome as the moment of childbirth. I felt the same way I did when I delivered our daughters. This was our new baby boy, the one that Mark and I had dreamed of. We'd named him.
The name they had chosen was Mitchell Ty Tiemann.
They were bonded very, very quickly. When Leanne was taking care of the baby, she was always holding Mitch, keeping track of Mitch, so she knew right where he was.
I remember praying that I was making the right decision, and I wished so much that Mark was going to be there. But there was no doubt in my mind. This was our son.
After several more days of exhausting work, Carol, Leanne, and 100 babies were ready to make the trip home.
Friends of Children of Vietnam was to be the first plane out with Operation Babylift. But the government was annoyed with us for having broken a regulation the day before, so they took us off the first place position. And we stood on that runway and watched as the first plane load of orphans, the one I had just begged to be on, crashed after takeoff, killing half of the adults and children on board. And when that plane crashed, so did I. All we knew was that it had been sabotaged or shot down. That was the only information that we had at the time. I was afraid I'd never get out of the country alive. I had every reason to believe that if they blew one plane out of the air or sabotaged the first one, they would do that to any subsequent flights as well.
But the operation couldn't be abandoned. And arrangements were made for an Air Force cargo plane to be stripped and outfitted with cardboard boxes to hold its very precious cargo. Operation Babylift had begun.
Because there were only 3 of us to take all these babies to the airport, we had to leave half of the babies, about 50 of them, and Mitch, back at the orphanage center for the second load.
By now, the Viet Cong had entered the city and taken over key positions, making it nearly impossible to travel from one sector to another. Every minute spent loading the first group of babies meant 1 minute less to return for the 50 left behind. And finally, the clock ran out. The second group, including her own son, would have to leave on a later flight. But there was a problem.
When Ross said,
"No, Leanne, you didn't understand me."
Then he said, this one flight has been okay to leave. President Tu has said, this is the last plane out of Saigon. To be sure you ever see Mark and your little girls again, you've got to get on this plane.
I can't.
I remember just burying my head in his shoulder and sobbing and trying to decide what to do, because I knew the most important thing in my life was my family. And that's why I had to run for Mitch. I said, I'm not leaving without my son.
They quickly raced along back roads that would take them near the orphanage.
We could hear the bombs falling, and we knew every child we left would be at risk.
Unfortunately, the van was blocked from entering the compound.
I ran and I ran and I ran till my legs ached and my side burned. My breath was gone. I remember crying out for God to please give me more strength so that I could run harder, so I could get to the orphanage and get my son and get back to the plane before it left. When I walked into the nursery, I saw Mitch. As soon as he saw me, he raised his arms to me, sort of like, I knew you'd be back. I never doubted you. You're my mom.
But she didn't leave the orphanage with Mitch alone. Leanne took the time, once again risking her own life, to carry out every child left behind. Finally, the plane and its precious cargo were ready to fly to freedom.
As that plane took off, all those feelings I had at the time of the crash came back. Everybody on board was thinking the same thing, that the first plane crashed. And it's almost as if the babies understood. They were just silent.
No one said anything until the pilot was able to tell us that we were safe and free. And we were just all shouting and excited.
4 days later, Leanne and Mitch arrived home.
The plane landed and I let everybody else go first because I've got Mitch. And that's when I was greeted by Mark. And I remember just stepping into his arms and not wanting to let go.
His eyes just like cute.
It was probably the most incredible day in my life. I not only had my wife back, but I had a son as well. So it doesn't get any better than that.
As the Tiemann family settled into their new life, one more incredible surprise was waiting for them.
Carol came racing to my house one day saying, Leanne, remember that very first photograph you had me take of you in Vietnam? And she said, there's only one other person in the background, and it was Mitch. That was 3 days before I chose him, or before he'd chosen me.
One lone little baby standing up in a crib in the back of an otherwise empty room. What are the odds? I mean, there's only one person that gives odds like that, and that's God. I mean, that's incredible.
Altogether, Operation Babylift brought 3,000 Vietnamese orphans to new homes in the United States, loving homes like the one Mitchell Tiemann found thanks to the courage of his mother.
Something that I admire about my mom is her dedication to life. She's just really kind of passionate about everything she does. And she's extremely kind of happy, you know, and kind of exudes that to, I think, everybody around her.
It's a happiness that comes from knowing her life has been touched by a miracle.
I think there were a lot of little miracles within this big miracle. I set out to buy a dozen cupcakes to make a difference and intended to do nothing more than that. And then agreed to bring out just 6 babies. But the miracle was, it was 300 babies. And choosing my son has got to be another miracle. And then to go to the 25th anniversary reunion and stand before a couple hundred of the kids that we helped to bring out and to see them as successful, productive, happy members of our society, you just felt like you were in the midst of another miracle. It makes me wonder what's next, because it's clear to me this miracle's not over yet.